And it is a narrative story, meaning it is something that actually took place, but it is put together with some details that make it sound a little bit more like a story. And you almost wonder, is it real? Okay, and I promise you that this story is based on a true event, okay, which you can see back here. There's a picture of our friend Arrowhawk, okay? This book also goes in chronological order, which you might remember as sequence, okay, similar to the Aztec Gold article, where you notice there was a lot of dates. That is chronological order, simply said as sequence. Okay. Hawk, young and strong, soared high above an open field. His large eyes searched the dried grasses below. A mouse raced in and out of the stubble. Hawk swooped down, snatched his prey, and carried it to the fence post. There, in the autumn sun, he tore and ate the mouse with his hooked beak. Twang! Out of nowhere, an arrow streaked through the air and pierced Hawk's upper thigh and tail. He screeched in pain. A flash of movement on his left signaled more danger. Stunned by the arrow, Hawk hesitated. Then he beat his wings, rose above his attacker, and flew into the distant trees. Hawk tried to perch, but the arrow snagged all the small branches. He flew higher until he landed on an open limb in a red oak tree. Pain pulsed through his body. He pecked wildly at the arrow lodged in his thigh. Then he twisted his head and tried to push the arrow out of his tail. Blood seeped from the wounds, but did not budge. It was now part of him. Get up a little closer. I'm sorry, my camera's backwards. For 2 days and nights, Hawk rested in the high oak. He only left his roost to scoop water from a nearby stream. Ignoring his pain, he cleaned the wounds by gently picking the dirt and bugs from the openings. He then preened himself by sliding his beak down the shaft of each feather and tucking it into place. And preened means to clean and to comb. Weary, he slept. By the third morning, Hawk was angry and hungry. He spotted a black rat snake in the underbrush. He flipped his wings and glided down. Snatch! Hawk flew into a tree and held the snake against his limb. But he bent down to eat. His beak kept bumping into the arrow. After 3 tries, Arrowhawk finally pushed his head far enough into the side so he could eat his prey. And as you can see, the arrow goes like straight through his body, so it's very hard for him to get to the food. During the next 4 weeks, Hawk's wounds healed around the arrow, and he grew stronger. Then the days began to shorten, and cooler winds blew from the north. Hawk's instinct was to fly south and led him to the land that he knew. He glided over harvested fields and busy barnyards. He sailed south over highways and rest areas. Sometimes he perched on poles or power lines, watching for unsuspecting prey. Late one afternoon, Hawk caught a mouse in a hayfield and carried it into the cottonwood tree. As he tried to land, the arrow wedged itself between the trunk and branch. Hawk's right foot twisted backwards. He could not move out of the tree. Hawk flapped his wings several times, but he was still stuck. He peeked and jabbed and pulled the arrow with his beak. Nothing. Then, gathering his remaining strength, he beat his wings and pushed with his feet. Crack! Hawk's lower right leg snapped. At the same time, the arrow bent and the tip broke off. Pain shot through Hawk, but the push had been enough, and he was free. Okay, this is also a good shot if you can make it out. He's caught in some twigs, some limbs, and he also has his own limb to deal with, which is the arrow. Hawk flew up to the top of the cottonwood tree. Not only had he broken his leg, but he had reopened the arrow wounds. Fresh blood trickled down his body. He was exhausted and hungry. He had dropped the mouse and was too weak to hunt again. Before the sun set, Hawk was asleep. Hawk awoke to cooler winds and pelting rains. His broken bone had not punctured his skin, but the leg was painful under his weight. Hawk winced every time he moved, so he only used his left leg to land and perch. For the next 2 days, he took shelter in a grove of white pine trees, and gradually the bone began to mend. On the third morning, Hawk flew out into the gray sky. Even though the arrow continued to weaken him, he traveled south for 5 miles before he stopped. He searched for a remote tree to perch, but all he saw were buildings, cars, and people. This could be trouble. Hawk rested on a telephone pole. From his lookout, he spotted a field. Near dusk, he circled the open area and found it teeming, full of mice, which were easily caught. Later, he settled into a tall oak in the woods on the other side of the field. But every flight, every landing seemed to tire him more. Hawk closed his eyes and slept. Cold rains blanketed the area for the next 5 days. Chilled and hurting, Hawk remained in his safe roost. Finally, one afternoon, the sun broke through the trees. Still weak from the arrow, but hungry, Hawk left his perch. He was gliding over the field, now full of standing water, when he heard the chirping of birds close to the highway. Hawk flew ahead and saw a covey, meaning a group of sparrows, near the ground. He fluttered and bumped, one on top of the other. If Hawk could capture a bird, he would have his first good meal in days. On silent wings, he dove, talons ready. Just as he reached for his prey, invisible net entangled his feet. I'm sure we have predictions as to getting caught in a net, if that's a good thing or maybe a bad thing. Hawk screeched loudly again and again. He couldn't reach for sparrows, and he couldn't fly away. Hawk beat his wings faster and faster. The more he struggled, the more his talons and feet became twisted in the snare. He fought, he screeched, he pecked, he flapped and flapped and flapped, until darkness surrounded him. The fight was over. Every muscle relaxed in Hawk's head was covered. Every muscle relaxed as Hawk's head was covered, and he was taken away in a warm box. Later, gloved hands held him high, and he began to beat his wings, struggling for freedom. But a firm grip carried Hawk inside a building where an anesthetic helped him slip into a painless sleep. When he awoke, the arrow was gone, and his wounds were bandaged. Hawk sat in a small cage facing the woods. Weak and sore, he perched motionless, watching songbirds dart in the distance. Later, a tray of food and a bowl of fresh water were set within his reach. Hawk ate and drank. Day by day, he grew stronger. After his wounds healed, Hawk joined other hawks in a large flight cage. He had his own perch. He could flap his wings and glide from one end to another. Between flights, he preened. Remember, that means to groom himself, to comb himself. Many of his feathers felt longer and fuller. With the arrow gone, Hawk could now stretch and groom his tail feathers. Every other day, Hawk rode in a box to an empty field. He wore leather straps that were attached to a flight line Gloved hands tossed him into the air. Hawk felt the cold rush beneath him. He rose, flapped, and glided toward a small stand of trees. He knew his feeling of freedom well, but flight always ended when the line that he was attached to ran out and pulled him back. Every time Hawk crossed that field, his muscles grew stronger and he flew faster than the day before. Early one cold morning, Hawk rode to a farther field, another field, a field that he knew. Gloved hands brought him into the sunlight. Hawk was held high. His leather straps were cut and fell to the ground. Hawk felt the north wind brush his face, and he heard a voice. "You survived, Arrowhawk. Fly home." Familiar hands tossed him gently into the winter air. Hawk flapped his wings and skimmed the earth. Then he beat his wings harder, rose, and flew over the trees. And straight as an arrow, Hawk soared into the wild. I think that was an interesting idea of figurative language, was straight as an arrow. I think you get that. Good. So as you could notice, the story that had a good ending was in chronological order. It was a narrative. It continued from beginning to end. And I'm just going to hold this up for a moment, okay, so that you can read that. If you notice in the new format, the new lesson format, there are now some activities that are listed, okay, for you kids to kind of take what you're learning and go a little bit beyond. And one of the things that I put up there for you was to do a little investigative learning, and I gave you a website where you could go in and study a little bit more about the red-tailed hawks, not this one in particular. But you can go in there and take some notes, and maybe you can make a nice poster of sorts. It doesn't have to be big, okay? And I'd love to see it. So if you could forward it to me, my email, okay, and get it to me. And hopefully, if we get back to school, we'll be able to share some of those things in person. All right? I miss you, kids. Bye-bye.